Welcome everyone to today's video, and this week I'd like to share a personal story which hopefully helps to highlight how I went from living a very unconscious, very stressed out, very anxious, emotionally overwhelmed life, and how through a series of events and of course the integration of yoga into my life, I was able to find a pathway towards a more peaceful existence. And perhaps as important as that, or part of the pathway towards peace, is of course the ability for us to learn how to heal, to know what needs to be healed, and to have skills and techniques that we are able to use in order to move forward on that journey of healing. And for that reason also, I'm going to talk a little bit about the therapeutic power of yoga today. So I was sitting in India by the Ganges, very fortunately, having just completed a 200-hour teacher training some years ago. The river was flowing past, the sun was shining in the sky. It was an incredible day. I love sitting in that place and just reflecting and just watching the river flow by, also meditating and practicing. And then I realized that just a few months before, I'd been in Lagos, Nigeria, where I'd been living for a number of years, running my own business. And I'd been invited into a meeting to meet with the owner of our biggest client. And I remember going to that meeting, feeling very, very energetically depleted, feeling very, very stressed, suffering from an insomnia at the time, and as a result of that, always feeling tired, never having a good night's sleep, and generally just being under the day-to-day pressure of running a business, but in a way where I really didn't have a sense of what balance was. I didn't have any practices that were helping to bring me back to balance or to help guide me towards a more peaceful way of being in that particular way of life at that moment of time. Anyhow, I remember being called into this meeting, and I arrived at the meeting, and as the meeting progressed, well, let's just say it wasn't going very well. There was a gradually deepening abusive tone from the client towards me, and it's fair to say that we were massively over-dependent on that client. They represented a far too high percentage of our total business, and they kind of knew that. But at the same time, our team was becoming more and more worn down by the never-ending requests and the amount of energy that we had to expend into that particular relationship. To cut a long story short, halfway through the meeting, as the abuse was flowing towards me, I remember just asking for a pause in the meeting. During that pause, I went out, I called my business partner and I said, listen, I just need to let you know I've had a bit of an epiphany. I was feeling quite calm. And I just said, I've just realized that we really just can't work with these guys anymore. We just can't do it. So I'm just letting you know that I'm going to be going back into that meeting and I'm essentially going to be serving notice on our contract. Now, the thing about that, and the thing that he knew very well, my business partner, was that by letting go of that relationship and that contract, we were essentially ending our business, because unless we went and found an equally large client, we wouldn't have been able to sustain ourselves. And I knew that as well, but something in me in that moment just snapped. There was something in me that just said, Darren, you just can't do this anymore. There is so much healing that you need to do. There is so much work that needs to be done to understand why you're constantly pushing yourself into this state of excess and strain and not sleeping well and not looking after yourself and prone to emotional and anger outbursts and just generally not in a particularly healthy state, high blood pressure, constantly getting ill, feeling like I had a hangover most of the time and having a hangover most of the time as well. So something just clicked, something snapped, something fell away. It was just pure exhaustion where I said, I just simply cannot do this anymore. So I went back into the meeting. I very politely said that unfortunately we just wouldn't be able to work together anymore. There was a 3-month notice period. At the end of the 3 months, fortunately, we closed down the business and they took over many of our staff, which was a relief for me. And then really within 3 months of that meeting, I had no business. But I couldn't have been more pleased because I knew that this was the time that I needed to do exactly this and give myself the space to understand how I was going to begin to heal. Now, at that point, I'd been practicing yoga for about maybe 18 months. And of those 18 months, about a year, I'd been practicing on my own at home. But the practice that I'd be undertaking at that point was a very, very physically intense form of yoga, very sweaty, because of course I was living by the equator in Lagos, so any form of yoga was hot yoga. But it was a very intense, very physically demanding, lots of inversions, lots of arm balancing, very little rest, lots of flow, not much focus on the breath. I really, at that point, was getting a lot of benefit out of the practice, but I didn't really understand how to go deeper with it, or actually how much more benefit I could get from it if I started to adapt my practice. What I realize now is actually the intensity with which I was practicing that yoga at that time was merely a manifestation of all of the other tendencies I had in my life at that moment to push too hard and to push into intensity. Now, coming back to sitting by the Ganges in India a few months later, having completed my 200-hour teacher training in a relatively intense physical form of yoga, I came across the teachings of the great yogi Sri Krishnamacharya. I'm not going to go into the full details of Krishnamacharya now, but many of you who maybe follow this channel and who come to my classes and workshops and retreats may know more about this great teacher. But what I will say is that one of the things that was key, or the principles in general that he taught, was that when we practice yoga physically in the asana form of the practice, we shouldn't be pushing too hard, we shouldn't be seeking pain, there should really be no discomfort or pain at all once we're practiced. We should be trying to balance steadiness with effort. We should be gently trying to lengthen our breath, again without too much effort, all with the aim of creating a stable, peaceful and calm inner space, or what is called bhava, a felt experience within. Now, the difference between how I was practicing before and the way in which this teacher, this great teacher, was explaining how we should practice if we want to do the work of transforming the mind and letting go of our existing patterns, it had a profound effect on me. Such a profound effect on me that not only did I buy all the books that I could find on him or from his students, but I also managed to, very fortunately, be able to enroll myself in the school that his son founded whilst Krishnamacharya was still alive, to pass on his teachings. So I went and did another teacher training, which took 2 years. It was a much longer, much more detailed teacher training. And in that time, not only was I learning as a teacher how to teach, but I was also learning as a student how to practice. My practice got slower, my practice became more subtle, my practice became more mindful of the breath. I was more sensitive of balancing and letting go of tension and effort, with also creating stability in the body and the breath and the mind. And what I realized at this point was that this was exactly what I needed. It was the antidote to my fast-paced life. It was the antidote to my lack of conscious awareness of my body. It was the antidote to everything really that had been building for so many decades in my life. And I just began to notice as I got deeper into this practice, I got injured less, I felt a bit calmer, I was a bit more available, I was a bit more present, I was getting into far less arguments and so forth with people around me, less prone to emotional outbursts. So I could see, I could feel that actually as these practices started to take root, as their samskaras, as the patterns arising from practicing this way in my subconscious mind began to take hold, I suddenly began to see a completely new way of practice and a new way of living. As a result of the profundity with which that transformation took place, and of course there's still so much work for me to do on myself, I obviously began sharing those practices as well, but I also then became aware of the fact that one of the great aspects of the Krishnamacharya teachings was that he was also able to use yoga as therapy, what is called yoga therapy or chikitsa. And essentially this is where we work with individuals to use the tools and skills that we can learn from yoga to help bring people back to balance, to help people who have physical or psychological or emotional or spiritual imbalances, and being able to recognize those imbalances and know what the antidotes are to those individual imbalances. So I'm hoping that for those of you that are coming to my group classes or certainly working individually, you can notice that the way we practice is much more therapeutic. We're not trying to force, we're not just trying to do arm balances for the sake of doing them. Everything is focused on trying to cultivate more stillness, more peace, more balance, more gentle stability, so that ultimately in our lives, where we have to live the majority of the time not on our mats, we just start to become more balanced individuals, and we just feel calmer and more peaceful most of the time. It doesn't mean that we won't be prone to the stresses and strains of this modern world, because of course that is inevitable, but we have a vast and growing toolkit of skills and practices and inbuilt, newly trained algorithms that help us to recognize the signs of stress when they arise and to be able to step back from them, and at the same time to be able to lay down these new patterns that take us towards previously uncharted territory in terms of our psychological terrain. So, as always, I hope that you have found this video useful, and in subsequent videos I'm going to talk a little bit more about the value of yoga therapy and give a little bit more explanation as to what yoga therapy truly is. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.